It's Britcom Pod, la da da da. It's Britcom Pod, do 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 do. Hello. You're listening to part 2 of our look at Sean's show, and if you haven't listened to part 1, then some of this won't make a lot of sense, so go back and check that out if you haven't already. We are looking at Series 1, Episode 4, Greek Holiday, and we've already talked a lot about Sean Hughes in general and his career leading up to this point, so make sure you don't miss that. For everyone else, here it is. Enjoy. What about Sean's relationship with his father? This is, like I said earlier, this is pretty central to Sean Hughes' personality, frankly, I think.
Yeah.
And just how open he is about having a bad relationship with his father, you know, in public, in his material that his father might well see. So when we get into this episode, Tony, who is now kind of living as Sean and taking on his life, is on the radio talking about how he's healed his rift with his father and has also got Susan, and is basically the concept is Sean is watching someone else take his life and do everything much better.
Yes, fix all the problems that he's been living with. And
I thought, yes, we're gonna go somewhere here. This is sort of self-exploration, soul-searching stuff.
Yes.
Okay, what am I doing wrong then? If someone else can take my circumstances and do things better, maybe it's not my dad's fault. Maybe it's my fault.
Wow.
But no. What actually happens is some Sicilian gangsters turn up at the door. And we move on. And when I say Sicilian,
they're about as Sicilian as the Greek dancers.
Some suspiciously tanned gentlemen walking through the door. So it was just stuff like that was very frustrating, because having done a bit of research into Sean Hughes and watched his material a bit more, I know there's something there. I know he's trying to get to something there. So why not? Why not just follow through? And I guess the answer to that is probably because they were just throwing together a sitcom. They probably had about a month to write it and get it done. And maybe it wasn't as well thought out as, you want it to be. Perhaps this is a good chance to talk about Nick Whitby.
Okay, who's that?
Nick Whitby was the writer on the first series. The writing credits are Sean Hughes and Nick Whitby. Mm-hmm. My immediate assumption there is, okay, you got Sean Hughes, you've got his stand-up material, we've used a lot of that, and he's probably got an idea here. Yeah. And so they've brought someone in who's probably a good safe pair of hands, a dependable kind of, really knows his structure, to turn it into, to give it a bit of structure and make something of it. Yeah. And it's just done the best they can. However, the second series is written by Sean Hughes alone. Right. And I think the second series is a lot more linear, in the sense of he sets up some plot points and then kind of just keeps them through. It's not episodic. He has kind of plot lines that go through, which, as we saw with Time, Gentlemen, Please, when Richard Herring was having to churn episodes out week by week, that's quite a good way to just give you something to hold on to and starting point, rather than having to go, oh my God, new episode, I have to come up with a completely new idea. Mm-hmm. You've already got something, you've got the character set up, you can just kind of roll with it. It makes things a little bit easier, I think. And so maybe Sean Hughes is not an experienced sitcom writer, is doing that, perhaps even subconsciously falling back on that. Perhaps Nick Whitby is the one who was trying to bring something slightly more meta and deconstructionalist into this. And when I looked into his other credits, more of a theatre guy, frankly, writes plays. Yeah. But from what little I saw, I think he is trying to break things down a bit more. And even with theatre compared to television, theatre is a lot more metaphorical. You're literally on a stage and you have to make the audience believe that this is going on. And there's a greater suspension of disbelief. Yeah. One of the things that Nick Whitby is credited with is a show called Cows, which was made in 1997. It was kind of a pilot.
Oh, I do know Cows. Eddie Izzard.
Yes, well, that was it. When I first read that, it was like, oh, it's Eddie Izzard's idea. He wrote it. Yeah. Again, maybe they brought this guy in, safe pair of hands, to help structure it. Yeah. Because it is a kind of a weird, surreal, wacky idea about cows.
It sounds very Eddie Izzard, doesn't it?
Yes, and I watched it, actually. It was crap.
I watched Cows relatively recently, in the last year or two, and it wasn't great.
Yeah, I mean, the most notable stuff is about it is the actors are in it. It's a real kind of 90s vibe to the actors. So I'm thinking maybe Nick Whitby is a bit more of a deconstructionalist here, and
he's the anarchist.
I looked into him a little bit, and I found an interview with him, which was just a kind of a bit of a puff piece because he was promoting a play he was doing, but it was one of those interviews that was just like they'd obviously just sent him a load of questions and then he'd answered, and it was literally punctuated as here's a question, here's an answer, and even in that he went totally meta with it. Like so one of the questions was, when I'm not in the theatre, I can be found ? Right?
Yeah.
And his answer was, yes, usually, but not necessarily always.
Yeah.
So, like, things like that, but, like, every single question, he did not give a straight answer. It was like, and, like, fair enough, it was actually quite clever and amusing in a kind of puff piece website interview kind of way. So, fine. But I think he's obviously of a mindset of like, well, I'm not just going to play by your rules. I'm going to break things up and make you think in a different way. So I think Nick Whitby, whoever that is, might have had more of an influence on this than Sean Hughes.
That's interesting. That's really interesting insight.
Can I ask you, in your purview of cultural knowledge here, someone else who gets referenced a lot in this series, and I didn't know who they were, I had to look it up, was Elton Welsby.
Elton Welsby. Well, yeah, I do know who Elton Welsby is. Well, he was basically the anchor for ITV Sport, for ITV's football coverage. And he was perfectly fine, Elton Welsby, nothing wrong with him, but he was just like, well, he's not Des Lynam, is he?
Well, they keep referencing him in this, but not with any sort of specific kind of character intent. So I couldn't figure out what the joke was, other than like, oh, look, we've referenced Elton Welsby. Ugh.
Well, yeah, it's just that slightly, offbeat second division, right? It's the Smiths rather than Rick Astley. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. That's just a very classic 1992 reference, I guess.
There was an episode, in fact, I think it was the final episode of Series 2 that I watched, where one of the many subplots was the European Cup final was on just round the corner, and it was Barcelona against Crystal Palace.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's ridiculous. Real Madrid against Crystal Palace, that's more realistic.
Though that's all derives from Sean Hughes was a big Crystal Palace fan.
Yeah, absolutely.
And obviously has written this in to get Chris Coleman and Gareth Southgate to come and
Chris Coleman, Chris Armstrong and Gareth Southgate all appeared like 3 times in 3 separate occasions. Again, it's the same joke 3 times. They come in and ask him for some help. He kicks the ball and we see a goal. And as I was trying to get a screenshot of this, so because it's the England football man, it's Gareth Southgate on Sean's show, and I couldn't because they literally run in and run back out again, and I thought. I see in the credits that's Gareth Southgate and Chris Coleman, but I really can't. Is it?
Yeah.
So he's got them in, and obviously, this is 1993, so it's before Gareth Southgate missed that penalty. But these were proper players; they were Premiership players. So
Crystal Palace players.
Still.
Occasionally Premiership players. Sean Hughes is a massive Crystal Palace fan, and there's another thing he did for the BBC just after this, actually. I think about 94. Called Sean's Shorts, which was just these 10-minute things of him just pottering about doing things. It was very loose narrative to that as well.
Wow.
But interestingly, one of those is, and this is obviously all he'd written in the plot treatment, Sean trains at Crystal Palace Football Club with the team, and that was it. Like they were just filming him like playing football with them. This was just wish fulfillment there.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what I really liked about the Sean's Shorts that I watched. This puts it in a time and place for you. First 2 minutes, they have guest appearances by The Wonder Stuff and Carter USM.
No, you see... So this is what I mean about this being my time. Like, I was a Britpop guy. When Britpop happened, I was 1995. I was 19, 20. And, I had a bit of money in my pocket and I went out and I got to, I would buy all the CDs. So I was into Britpop. But as I'm older now and I look back on that period, I actually find myself listening to the stuff that came before. So yeah, Wonder Stuff, Kingmaker, Carter, those sorts of shoegazy bands that I think we called them at the time. And that is really my era, definitely.
So just before we give up on the episode altogether, let's just deal with the end. Well, kind of the ending where some Sicilians and some Greeks come in. Some
There's a big
suspiciously
shootout.
Tanned, mustachioed men. Well, there is a big shootout and a fight, which I can only assume looked absolutely terrible because they've used every trick in the book to try and make it work.
Slow motion.
Lots of close-ups, slow motion, sound effects. I looked up the actors who were playing them, and one of them is a stuntman. Like three of them are actors, basically. One of them is a stuntman. So he must have been the one that fell over the cupboards. He must have been actually the one who did the action. It looks crap even with every effort they've made. But the joke is that Sean doesn't even notice it's happening because he's just discovered that the person he thought he was in love with is actually a man. And he's gay now. So, but I thought I wanted to mention this sort of little gay subplot here because that felt very 1992 as well. And that feels very in keeping with this kind of attitude that I'm talking about, early 90s poet kind of idea.
Yeah.
The idea of struggling with not actually being gay or even bisexual, but struggling with your sexuality. Like that's it's got to be a struggle. Everything's got to be a struggle.
For Sean, sure.
But like Morrissey's probably bisexual, right? So I should be, yeah. That's the idea.
Being open to it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it actually comes across quite nicely for something that was made 30 years ago. Yeah. It actually gets away with it as not being too homophobic.
But think, this is 1992, so this is 15 years after that episode of Rising Damp that we watched with Peter Bowles in it, which was very, backs to the walls, lads, completely old-fashioned attitude. And, 15 years later, that was the change in society that being reflected. Yeah,
because basically what we get here is Sean going, oh, well, I'm gay. Okay, fair enough, I'm gay. But also going, oh, God, I'm gay. How am I going to tell my mother? It's like that kind of, hey, I'm cool with it, but some people aren't, so it's going to be a thing, But also that kind of sense of wanting to be gay or wanting to be bi, whatever, just because it makes you different. It makes you an outsider.
It's cool. It's cool.
Yeah. Which I think now it's not anymore. It's a bit too normal.
No, you're absolutely right. We're probably hitting a time period here in the early 90s where exploring one's sexuality was cool.
And then everything just kind of ends. Tony dies at the end.
Yeah.
But he comes back, so don't worry about
it. Don't worry, listeners. He's all right.
There is another actor who was a regular in the first series and then ended up actually becoming one of the primary characters in the second series, but isn't in this episode. I think this was the only one he's not in, just happened to pick this one.
Yeah.
And that's Michael Troughton.
Michael Troughton, who is, when he appeared on screen, I shouted, "Oh, Piers Fletcher Dervish."
Yeah, exactly. In fact, one of the episodes in Series 2, it just sort of cuts to him and he's chatting with someone and goes, actually, I think people remember him more as Piers Fletcher Dervish. So, this is just silliness. So that's the sort of, meta thing they were doing. But yeah, actually, not to give too many spoilers away, but we'll be dealing with Michael Troughton quite soon in the future.
Yeah.
So...
let's not talk too much about him.
Yeah, and he's a much more significant role in what we were doing in the future. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, I guess. But yes, he was still in the New Statesman at the time. This went out the same year as the fourth series of New Statesman, I think, something like that. Yeah, okay. So it was all kind of going at the same time. A very different character. And in the first series specifically, he's the barman of the local bar, and he's supposed to be a bit of a kind of London hard guy that works in a bar. I'm not quite sure I buy that. Definitely more convincing as a Piers Fletcher Dervish.
Well, it just seems like Piers Fletcher Dervish with sideburns.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about my theme nights I'm having?
Brilliant. What are they?
Alienation night. One person at a time. Oi, bastard! Wait your turn! I thought it'd be good for business.
He's definitely doing something with it, but yeah. Let's leave him. Let's.
Yeah, we'll leave him for another time, Alan. We'll leave him for next time.
It won't be long. If you're a fan of Michael Troughton, don't worry.
Okay, well, look, I think we've probably finished with our episode there. So this was in Series 1. Why don't you said earlier you want to talk about the differences between Series 1 and Series 2. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, basically, like I said, we lost a writer. Nick Whitby wasn't involved in the second series. I don't know why. I don't know if there's any kind of reason specific behind that. Maybe Sean just felt like, I'll do it myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, the second series is, if anything, less deconstructionalist. They still have those moments where it's talking to the audience and things like that. But if anything, it's a bit more sitcom-y and has plot lines running through it, mostly revolving around his love life. So he meets a woman in the second series and then they have a sort of a to be continued over to the third series because someone gets killed and they think that the police investigation is going on. So there's like these kind of continuing plot points. But they'll continue for 2 episodes and then drop off.
Yeah.
But then, he meets another woman, and so she's there for a couple of episodes, and she wants a baby, so that's the plot line that's kind of going along. A little bit more linear and narrative, and not even really much of an attempt to break down what Sitcom is all about, which is like what I say, I think that might have been Nick Whitby's influence more.
So do you perceive that as an improvement? Do you prefer Series 2?
No, because it's still not any funnier.
Okay.
But it feels like it's not even trying anymore.
Oh dear.
So, and it does feel like it's just repeating ideas. So in the second series, instead of having a sock that will never get dry, the kind of running thing is that he's made scrambled egg and they've burnt onto the saucepan and he can't get them off. And so every episode he's trying something new to get them off.
Okay.
Or, God is calling him instead of Beckett. Every time he answers the phone, he puts some jazz on. And then holds the phone up. So he goes, "Oh, sorry, I'll just have to turn this jazz down." "Yeah, sorry, what is it?" Which I quite like that as a joke. He did it every time the phone
interesting.
rings. Because he's like, "Oh yeah, I've started listening to jazz because that's that's what Morrissey would do." So I like that. That was in keeping with the character. But yeah, I don't feel like that it goes anywhere. It doesn't develop anywhere. And there's some weird musical elements that are added in, which you don't really get in the first series.
Yeah, I noticed. I watched the first episode of Series 2, and in the what's now the wine bar, which was the pub, there's Pulp. Pulp are on stage, but we never see them. They never play. We never talk to them. It's literally Pulp in the background. There they are, and nothing happens.
The idea being that there's a band playing in the bar and it's Pulp, but they weren't big enough to be.
Well, they probably were still playing pubs back then in '93. Yeah. But the point stands. Like, if you're going to get a band in, you can do something with them. I wonder if they'd filmed something and it was cut later. I don't know.
Maybe, possibly, yeah. Because in the last episode they get the Cure in, but they actually reference it and speaks to. Well, he thinks Robert Smith is his mum.
Okay, well, that's quite funny.
Gag, isn't it? They do reference that one, but then in the second episode they do a Grease where he meets this woman basically, and they're like, "Oh my God, I'm in love," and so they do the Summer Nights song from Grease. You know that one?
Yeah.
Summer lovin' had me a blast.
Summer lovin' happened so fast.
Met a girl crazy for me.
Met a boy cute as can be.
Summer days drifted away. Oh, the summer night. Oh, well. Tell me more.
And they have obviously professional dancers come in and go, tell me more, did you get very far? Like that whole bit.
Yeah. So they do a whole production.
And the woman who's playing the girlfriend, who's in it for a couple of episodes, I looked her up. She's basically a musical theatre person.
Okay.
So they obviously brought her in to do that. And they do the whole Summer Nights thing. Big song and dance number. Yeah. And it's not a joke. They just do it. There's a couple of like little visual gags. It's not even like funny because Sean's a bad singer, because he's not obviously not professional, but it's not funnily bad.
Yeah.
He's kind of keeping up with the dance routines. The actual dance maneuvers around it is perfectly valid. I don't know what it was. It was like watching.
Is that wish fulfillment then? Is that like Jim fixed it for him to go on telly and do a Grease number?
Yeah, it was weird. And I've never really pegged Sean Hughes as like a...
I wouldn't have had him as a Grease guy.
Like, well, or even as I want to sing. Like, Steve Coogan will sing any opportunity he gets. Ricky Gervais, every show he makes is about a character who wants to be a singer. Yeah. So I don't know where that came from. And it wasn't funny. And it just felt like... And there was quite a few things like that where it just felt like we were filling time. So, yeah, the second series was definitely a bit of a downhill. And then they have one episode where the whole thing is kind of in flashbacks because they wake up in hospital and they're like, oh, what's happened? Let's and then you get like the same story from three different perspectives, you know. And again, that feels like, okay, are they playing with the form there? But it didn't feel like that. It just felt like, well...
They've had the idea.
Yeah, doesn't really go anywhere. But a lot more actors being brought in the second series, though.
Well,
some very interesting people.
I was thinking about guest appearances, and this is something that we look at regularly. So in that episode I mentioned where Pulp are in the background at the wine bar, we also have an appearance from B. Arthur off of The Golden Girls, which I must confess I was taken aback with that. I'm guessing The Golden Girls was contemporary with this show. It was probably Sean's show was on in between series of the Golden Girls. It was in the same slot on Channel 4 on a Friday night.
Yeah, probably.
That's a good joke. No, that is good. So the setup is, because we're breaking the conventions of sitcom, it's the second series and we're going to try and get more ratings. So he buys this ratings package, and one of the things that comes with that ratings package is it says, have the Golden Girls round for dinner. And so he has these cardboard cutouts of the 4 Golden Girls. And he's talking to them, he's pretending, doing the voices and all that sort of thing. Yeah, okay, that's a mildly funny gag. That works. And then 20 minutes later, B. Arthur turns up in the bar.
Yeah, he takes the B. Arthur cardboard cutout to the pub to pretend he's got a girlfriend. Yeah. And then B. Arthur walks in. Like, what's going on? She does one line, walks off, and that's it. Like, she obviously was just...
I wonder why she was in London.
She was probably around. She was going to do an interview on Wogan or something, and just popped in. But it was nice.
It was good. It was good. What other guest appearances do we have on Sean's show?
Well, in the second series, Mira Sayal turns up for a couple of episodes. A young... As far as I'm concerned, like, before Goodness Gracious Me, I don't know anything about Mira Sayal. So, like, anything before that was like, oh, shit. So, yeah, she's a love interest for a couple of episodes. Mm-hmm. She's very good in it.
We mentioned Windsor Davis is in there with a tub of jelly in the back.
Well, that's the first series, and it's the very first episode. And so they very deliberately brought him in as sitcom. He is sitcom, and we're trying to reject that.
Yes.
And great work from Windsor Davis to just happily embrace that.
He's proper Windsoring it up, isn't he?
Yeah.
Doing the old wiggling the eyebrows, the whole thing.
Yeah. And I quite like Windsor Davis in general. So the fact that they're rejecting him is what doesn't work about this whole thing. Yeah. But a bit more of that would have been great in that first series. A bit more stuff like that. Anita Dobson turns up in one episode where she plays the bartender's wife, but then she's not in anything else, and she's not really in much at all.
She would have been, she was at EastEnders. She was Anita Dobson off of EastEnders then, wasn't she?
Yeah. But like in the episode, one of them goes, oh, I didn't know you were married to Anita Dobson. So it's like they kind of break the wall on that as well. Yeah. Both of them, Michael Triton and Anita Dobson, both appeared in Get Well Soon, of course, in 1997. Yeah. Oh, Brian Cox turns up as a sort of hard priest.
You mean, of course, Brian Cox as in Irish Succession guy?
Yeah, not as in in physics, space brilliant,
in gravity brilliant.
So, no, the hard Brian Cox. Again, it's supposed to be this person from Sean's childhood, like a religious leader from his childhood who was, when he was at the Catholic school. But then the character is a different person, and again, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, why are we exploring someone from your childhood if then it's not what they represent? We're not asking any questions. You've just got Brian Cox in to kind of play a priest with a leather jacket. It doesn't really make any sense. Oh, Michael Sheen turned up in one episode.
Michael Sheen? He must have been a young man then.
He's a very young man. But what's really fascinating about that is he turns up and he plays a mugger. Uh-huh. And then actually quite some funny bits with him kind of interacting with the mugger, and like he hasn't got anything worth nicking and all this sort of stuff.
Listen, before I go, could I just get a quick shot?
What?
Well, just something for the grandchildren one day,
Okay. Have you put the timer on?
Aye, timer's on.
Do you want me to look scared?
Yeah? I look scared. Cheers, thanks very much,
No
John.
problem. So when will I get my car back? You just throw that in a bin or something?
No, I'll pop it in the post.
Oh, cheers. And when should I call the police? A couple of days?
No, just a couple of minutes. I'm swift as the wind.
Good Thomas, eh? He's a very good thief. Very good.
What really stands out is like Michael Sheen. You can tell he's just great. Like he's just got a great presence. Yeah. You're good, aren't you?
He's got
a really good
him.
actor.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, there's something about him, yeah. And maybe there's some sort of confirmation bias there, because I know...
Yes, perhaps. Yeah.
But
wonder
he stands out.
That if you'd have seen it in 1993, yeah. Can I ask you, before we sort of wrap up on Sean's show, one thing that I wanted to talk about was this idea of... It's basically an adapted stand-up show. Sean Hughes is not the first nor the last stand-up comedian to star in a sitcom. But what about this idea of taking that stand-up show, that stand-up persona, and sort of force-feeding it into a sitcom mould? Can you think of any other examples of that either positive or negative examples?
Well, you know what? I was trying to think of stuff like this, and really there aren't many. An early example that jumped out to me as a potential comparison, Frankie Howard, Up Pompeii.
Yes.
Because, that is a sitcom and there's a whole plot going on. But then he'll stop and he'll talk to
That's a really good example.
And he's talking to the audience as Frankie Howard. I know he's in character, but it's like, it's his act. And admittedly, Frankie Howerd as a stand-up act, it's not quite the same as a Sean Hughes stand-up act because it's written for him. It's just an act. It's a persona, as opposed to a stand-up, and certainly in our modern idea of a stand-up, is someone who will get up and kind of bare their soul a little bit. There's a real sort of sense of personal attachment there.
Yeah.
To the point where, you get the likes of a Joe Pasquale, that kind of feels cheap and knocked off now these days because it's not personal, because you're just a gag man. But yeah, so Frankie Howerd, as much as that was just a persona, that is very much like, how do we get this persona into a sitcom format? Because we can't really just get Frankie Howerd into a sitcom because it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, because you've got to be Frankie Howerd.
Yeah.
What about Alan Partridge? I know that's a character, maybe not quite the same, but Alan Partridge's shows are, particularly Knowing Me, Knowing You. That was basically an adapted stage show, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think Knowing Me, Knowing You is deconstructing chat shows.
It's not a sitcom, is it?
It's
the later Alan Partridge series were, but I think Knowing Me, Knowing You specifically, it's a deconstructed chat show. It's not a sitcom, I don't think.
Yeah, I know, but it's certainly not a million miles away. You've got a situation and you've got your regular character. But yeah, that is much more of a satire on that. It's parodying things, and it's perhaps parodying more than deconstructing them. What Sean's show is smashing it all down and trying to create something out of the rubble. Knowing Me, Knowing You is going, hey, look at all these things you recognise slightly off kilter. So that's not quite the same, but it is. It is an example of, we've got this comedy character. What do we do with it? And I think there's a bit more of that. Al Murray, Pub Landlord, very much Time Gentleman Plea was, okay, we have this stand-up character. That's a stand-up act, but it's a character. It translates to that a bit more. The Young Ones is very much based on the characters these guys were doing on stage.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I came up with a couple of thoughts on this, and there are series that are where you're kind of looking at a stand-up's life off stage, the Seinfeld type model. And the couple that I came up with there was Josh Widdicombe, his sitcom Josh, and more recently Catherine Ryan in The Duchess, which is very sort of autobiographical. But in both of those cases, we're not seeing their stand-up persona. We're seeing a stand-up comedian off duty. So then I thought, well, where do we actually see a persona? And I think Jack D in Lead Balloon, and I think they acknowledged that was very much based on Larry David. But I think that's probably Curb Your Enthusiasm. So I think that's an example of that. But I tell you the one that I came up with, which I think is closest to Sean's show, where it's a stage show adapted and spun out for TV. The one I came up with was Mighty Boosh, and I think that's got a similar genesis. It was an anarchic stage show, which was then adapted and written longer, as it were. But I think the Boosh works, and it might be interesting to watch that again. But I certainly have good memories of the Boosh.
Do you know what? I've been putting off watching the Boosh again because I'm terrified that it's gonna not stand up at all. Yeah. I remember enjoying it a lot. That was at least 10 years ago.
Same. And having just watched something that I loved 30 years ago and really, really not enjoyed it. I'm a bit nervous about that. But I think, for me, that's the best example I could come up with of that spun-out stand-up show being successful as a sitcom.
Yeah, but even the Mighty Boosh, it's not people stand up and they go, oh, well, here's some anecdotes about my life. They're characters.
Sure.
It's a lot easier to translate that into some sort of fictional world.
Yeah.
Like I said earlier, there was obviously a bit of a push for this around this time because Frank Skinner won the Perrier Award and Channel 4 obviously went to him and said, do you want to do a sitcom? Have you got any ideas? Mm-hmm. And he wrote and starred in Blue Heaven.
Yes.
Which, again, is something I haven't watched for years. I have to watch that again at some point. It didn't get a second series like Shane, but so obviously wasn't as good as that. But I was looking into, stand-ups transferring to sitcom because, in America, the whole point of being a stand-up is to try and get a gig on a sitcom. Like that's how the industry works.
Yes.
But I think in Britain, stand-up is a bit more of an industry on its own thing, and especially, like I say, in the last 20 years, it's been embraced a little bit more, and you can get on telly and stuff doing stand-up.
Yeah, I don't think in 1992 that was the case. There wasn't that.
No.
You couldn't make a living for the rest of your life doing stand-up comedy in 1992.
Well, you could, but not a good one. You'd be working the clubs. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. As an old-fashioned turn rather than an alternative comedian. And so the route still was get on telly. Now, in the 80s, we saw Saturday Night Live and we saw stand-up shows being created. But essentially, even if, you look at the Young Ones and Bottom, all of those alternative comedians also made sitcoms. That was the route in.
Yeah, and I think we've never quite lost that. There's always been this idea of, well, if you can write comedy and you're funny, then why not write a sitcom? It doesn't necessarily translate, but often it can. Like, so I thought of some examples of stand-ups who have kind of transferred to sitcom in some way or another. Dylan Moran, Black Books, which also has Bill Bailey in it, who was primarily a stand-up, but has done a fair bit of acting. But Dylan Moran wrote all that as well.
Yeah. Are we just airbrushing Graham Linehan out of that?
We don't talk about Graham Linehan. But yeah, Graham Linehan as well. But obviously, interestingly, Father Ted, your two main stars there, Dermot Morgan and Adel Hanlon, were both stand-ups. Yeah. But that was not written for them. They auditioned and got a part, and they just happened to be primarily stand-ups. I mean, Dermot Morgan basically never did any other acting. He was a stand-up. I thought of a couple of other examples. Baddiel syndrome.
Yeah,
and we talked about that when we were talking about Sky One sitcoms. That was very much like David Baddiel will build something around your kind of persona.
Okay, that's interesting, because I think I said when we talked about it, I never saw that. But I just assume it's David Baddiel being David Baddiel.
Yeah, he's not. Yeah, again, not.
I'm a fan of David Baddiel, but an actor he is not.
What about Peter Kay? Right, because I think Peter Kay was one of the people who ushered in the revival of stand-up comedy on television, because Peter Kay, everyone suddenly went, oh, hang on, no, your mum wants to watch stand-up as well. Oh, okay, it's not just for young people who are drinking in pubs.
Live at the Apollo, Michael McIntyre, all of that flows from Peter Kay. I think you've got something there, yes.
But Peter Kay quite quickly transitioned that into character comedy.
Yes.
And he does not do sitcoms where he's like, hey, I'm Peter Kay, I'll do this.
Yeah.
He does sitcoms where he creates characters and he plays characters. He did a whole anthology series where he could try lots of different ones out, and one of them became a series. So that was obviously something he wanted to do. But again, I think he's something of an exception. Another one I thought of was Not Going Out.
Yes.
Which is written by Lee Mack, and it's, I mean, the style of that material, it's Lee Mack, it's Tim Vine, it's that one-liner. But they do manage to string it together in a way that actually works as a sitcom, which if you'd asked me before I'd seen it, I'd say I bet that doesn't work very well. I'm not very good with the modern stuff, anything in the last 20 years, but another one that I was thinking of was Miranda.
Yeah.
Which is, again, very much based on her stage persona, which is a sort of slightly exaggerated version of what Miranda Hart is in real life, as I understand it. Again, she talks directly to the audience.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison, actually. But I watched a couple of episodes of Miranda recently, actually, and I got to tell you, it's a lot better than Sean's show. It's a lot more coherent.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting discussion, and I suppose you can play around with those definitions about sitcoms built around a stand-up persona. If any of our listeners have got any suggestions or things we might have missed there, or any thoughts, I think that's a really interesting discussion. So, I'd be happy to continue that on social media afterwards.
So yeah, just to get back to Sean's show a little bit, I wanted to talk to you about the director who did both series, called Sylvie Bowden.
Ah, yes.
Looking at her career, one of her earliest credits is as a production manager. So you sort of work your way up. And one of her earliest credits is in 1985 for The New Statesman, and she was also a production manager on Alexis Hale's Stuff.
Ah, that's something that we've come across many times.
Yeah, and what about this? I think you're going to like Sylvie Bowden in general. Her earliest directing credits in the late 80s on episodes of Blankety Blank.
Oh, marvellous. Excellent.
Which is a big favourite of yours. But Sean's show seems to be the first time that she was given a series of like, hey, look, this is your thing, go and do something with it. Which I think is probably quite telling of what they were doing with it. I guess it's Channel 4, it's going out at 10:30 on a Wednesday night. I don't think they were exactly throwing their eggs into one basket here. This was a small scale thing. Hey, let's give it to a young director, sort of up and coming. Followed that straight up with Series 3 of So Haunt Me.
Oi.
Which feels much more like, okay, we need to do basic standard sitcom stuff here.
Yeah.
And but did quite a lot of sitcom. Did Faith in the Future, Julia Sawallo's in that. Keeping Mum with David Haig, Stephanie Cole.
Oh yes, we talked about that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Duck Patrol.
Duck Patrol.
Do you remember Duck Patrol?
No, I don't. What's Duck Patrol?
Duck Patrol has a young David Tennant in it as well. Kind of most people remember it, but it's about they're park keepers or something. It's very light.
It sounds like a kids program.
Light touch kid thing. Well, Richard Wilson's in it, and Samantha Beckinsale's a regular.
Oh
in
wow!
it as well.
Okay, right. We've got many links, many connections.
But yeah, Sylvie Bowden ended up working on the bill and then ended up becoming the producer of the bill, moved from director to producer, and was the producer, as far as I understand, until the bill finished. And doesn't seem to have done that much since then. That was like 10 years ago. So
yeah, she didn't produce the bill into the ground then?
She was there when it set afire, put it that way. So I just wanted to mention Sylvie Bowden. I thought that was quite an interesting CV. And Sean's shows where she started, really, as a director in terms of sitcom.
Well, shall we wrap up Sean's show then? I think of all the sitcoms that we have watched so far for this series, this was the one which had the greatest gap between my expectations / memory and the crushing reality of it.
Yeah.
I was really disappointed, if I'm honest. I was really disappointed with it. Let's try and be nice. It's an interesting cultural artifact. It tells us a lot about the time. It tells us a lot about the state of British comedy at the time. I know Sean Hughes is Irish, but, I'm talking about as a culture. I think, despite what we said at the start of this podcast, I think, in my opinion, it's not a sitcom. It doesn't work as a sitcom. It really struggled without following that format. I think it's an extended stand-up routine, and that's why it's repetitive. Being repetitive in and of itself is not a bad thing. Fast show, you could say that's just the same gag over and over again. That works. I'm not really sure why Sean's show doesn't work in quite the same way. I think it's probably unfair to judge this as a sitcom because I don't think it is a sitcom. But this is the British Sitcom History Podcast, and so, if we are judging it on those terms, then I'm afraid I don't recommend it. I didn't enjoy it.
Well, I think this is where we differ. I think it does qualify as a sitcom, and it's not very good at it, as opposed to not... I think it's trying to be a sitcom. I think
it's trying to be a sitcom, I just don't think it's succeeding.
See, for me, the problem with it is that it's not funny enough. And let me be clear, I didn't dislike it. You seem to really hate it. Yeah. But I found it watchable, and there's some nice moments, there's some funny moments. I just don't think it's particularly good as a whole overall thing.
Yeah.
More than that, I was frustrated because it's obviously leaning towards doing something. It wants to be meta. Instead of just wacky, but it never gets there, and there's no follow through on anything, and that comes down to the comedy as well. There's not even any follow through on gags or even you don't have to be clever, but at least be funny, and it's kind of not either.
Yeah,
but it's just funny enough to kind of be okay, and it's charming, and like I say, there's something about Sean Hughes that I just really like, which I think his career is based on, frankly. Like that he's just quite he's got a kind of an energy on stage that makes you sort of warm to him, despite his misanthropic ways. I like it's so stuck in its time. I like those kind of early 90s references and stuff like that. I find that kind of all very kitsch, I suppose. But that only works in retrospect. Like, obviously, that wouldn't really have played if I'd watched it at the time.
I think the point about retrospection is that one has to acknowledge, I have to acknowledge, that I've changed. So when I was 17, I loved this. And I don't think it's suddenly become rubbish over 30 years. I think I've changed. My perception, my tastes have changed. So I liked the idea that it was anarchic. I liked the idea that it was throwing the sitcom form out the window. And I liked the idea of Sean Hughes being sort of romantic and interesting and challenging you to understand the references. And now I'm 46. And, as we've watched all these sitcoms over the last couple of years, the last couple of series, my tastes are mainstream. I like Steptoe and Son. I like Rising Damp. I like Dear John. These are mainstream, safe sitcoms that are great. And I think that I've changed, and I have to accept that. And now this sort of anarchic thing that I loved when I was 17 just gives me a headache.
And so by Gareth's request, next week we're doing Last of the Summer Wine. Just to sign off, let's sign off with Sean Hughes as well. We talked about what he did to get to this point, but he never did another sitcom, really. Certainly not where he was a star. And in many ways, his star faded. He burned bright very young. He got on Nevermind the Buzzcocks, which at that time, that was a great bread and butter thing to have as a stand-up because,
things that was appealing about that. It was nasty. It was cruel. It had people on there that it would really denigrate.
Well, Mark Lamar has that.
But I think Sean Hughes has that as well. I think Sean Hughes had that in him.
I think he did, but Sean Hughes had that thing where he could do it with a bit of a cheeky wink. And
with a twinkle in his eye.
It was all right, yeah. But I think that's why it worked. And I think his style of humour, sort of quite a gentle humour, works on that. He's not really a gag man. When I'm watching his stand-up, it's not particularly funny, but it's a nice presence. It's amusing. Yeah. And I think it works on something like that. He left that show. They didn't leave him. He decided to have enough of that. And I definitely got the feeling with Sean Hughes that he didn't like fame by any means. He didn't really like people. So doing anything where people would come up to him and say hello was no good. And I think he stepped away from it at one point, and he stopped doing stand-up for a long time. Went back to that 2007, I think it was, something like that. A bit later. It was after his dad had died. And he kind of managed, that inspired him enough to do a show. And I think I was listening to something where it was almost a sense of ironic justice that the death of his dad and his relationship with his dad inspired this show, because it's the last thing his dad would have wanted, to inspire him and help him in his career. So quite like that. There's quite a lot of venom in him still. Yeah. And just in terms of acting, not a sitcom exactly, but certainly very light-hearted in tone. The Last Detective, did you ever see that? Peter Davison.
No, I didn't see it, but I know what you mean. I'm familiar with it, yes.
So it's Peter Davison as a detective. It's based on a series of novels. And Sean Hughes was the mate, like the kind of, and very much a comedic element. Like the whole show is very kind of a light touch comedy.
Was he not in Coronation Street for a little while?
Yeah, very briefly, playing a love interest of someone.
Oh, okay, so it wasn't a long-term thing.
No, it was like a handful of episodes sort of stint. Okay. Bit of slightly stunt casting, but yeah. But so he'd done a bit of acting, like what you would call proper acting. But even then, very much with a comedic feel.
Sure.
Many years. Wrote a couple of novels. Wrote a book of poetry, that sort of thing. So, classic sort of stuff that you want from a Sean Hughes.
Yeah.
Obviously, he was a heavy drinker and smoker and all that sort of thing, and it took a toll on his health, and died age 51. It's not much to speak of there, is there? That's Sean's show, a curiosity from the past.
Yeah, look, I'm really glad we covered this, and as I said, obviously I was a little disappointed with it, but I think it's, cultural artifact is the phrase that I used, and I think it's a really interesting thing. I would definitely, if anyone's listening and hasn't seen it, despite everything I've just spent the last hour saying, I would go and have a look at it. It's interesting. I probably wouldn't watch all 14 episodes back to back, but go and check it out.
The first episode, it'll be all right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for listening. This has been British Sitcom History Podcast, and we have been looking at Sean's show. And if you want to hear more from us, then go and check out our back catalogue. This is actually the 13th sitcom we've looked at in detail, and we have extra content looking at more obscure sitcoms just like this one. If you enjoy this show, then do please rate and review us on iTunes. That'll help us out. And of course, get in touch. We are on Instagram and Twitter at BritcomPod. That's at BritcomPod. Go and check us out. Send us your comments and your sitcom opinions. We have lots of interesting discussions there. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you will be back next time where we take on a true classic. Bye-bye.